I'm so impressed with you. Like you represent Alex Jones, you represent the Covington kids. You're for free speech, you're for the underdog. And I find the more people I talk to, whether it's like even in like the comic book world or the stand-up comedy world or entertainment, like there's always kind of like a woke versus non-woke side, it seems now, to every industry. And how do I wonder how that, and you've already spoken a little bit, like, yeah, you lost a couple friends when you started associating with Alex. But what has there been much of a backlash? Now it seems like if you're going to represent the Covington kids, Alex, you were a fan of Trump, but like not like an apologist. You're not trying to make it seem like he's this perfect guy. How do you deal with, I guess, the backlash? Or I'm sure you get a ton of shit for working with the people that you do.
Yeah, it just depends on the circle. So the first time people really got upset at me was, interestingly enough, a lot of Democrats were mad at me representing Ralph Nader because they were convinced that Nader was the reason why Gore lost in 2000. And Gore was from Tennessee, and I'm from Tennessee, so I knew a lot of people in the same circles. I used to be a Democratic political campaign consultant back in the early 90s, had become politically independent and kind of agnostic until Trump had been betting on elections but hadn't been voting in elections from 1996 until 2016. And so different reactions. But there were people, the first time people really went ballistic was Ralph Nader, oddly enough. And then everybody was chill about all the other controversial cases I took. And I used to say that I guarantee you there's somebody I've represented that somebody in the audience hates because my clients hate each other. Because they're that far apart politically on the spectrum. The only thing they have in common is that in my cases, they're underdogs. Even if they're millionaires or billionaires, in my cases, they're not the favorite. Because when you're up against the U.S. government, you're always the underdog. And did a lot of criminal tax cases in that context. But representing people, accused tax protesters and, everybody across the political spectrum. But it was only the next two that caused trouble was being associated with Trump. There were lawyer friends of mine that just went ballistic, blocked me on Facebook randomly, things like that, just because I said something favorable about Trump. And I've been a populist my whole life, so that shouldn't have been a shock to anybody. But and then the next thing was Alex Jones. People just go absolutely nuts about him. I had a lot of clients that would turn down representation as soon as they're like, oh, I like you, Barnes, but you represented Alex Jones, and I can't be associated with Alex Jones. I mean, the Daily Beast, I know who's writing the article, whether it's left or right, depending on who they associate with me. So when the right would write a hit piece on me, it would be Robert Barnes, lawyer for Wesley Snipes or Ralph Nader or Joe Francis or whomever. Mr. Girls Gone Wild, different. That's a different kind of client. But I didn't represent him in that area. I represented him in tax area. But man, wow. But yeah, another story. So the whole dynamic but it was interesting. I mean, there were some people that got really mad at the Joe Francis representation.
Why?
But some of them probably rightly. It's public that I didn't like him and didn't get along with him and finally got out of the case. Tried to withdraw multiple times. Now he was being framed by a lot of corrupt actors, and ultimately they dismissed, they did a plea deal where he did no time and paid like a $2,000 fine and got to keep a lot of the money. So, and that was based on the fact that I was able to document entrapment was going on. The whistleblower was actually really working for the government and getting a percentage of the cash, and he was actually the CFO and the CTO of the company and all of that. But Joe had a deserved reputation for maybe some other things that were more problematic, and only some of which is public knowledge. But I was not a fan. I wanted out, didn't want to represent him. For the most part, I only represent clients that I like, at least. I'm in the privileged position of being there. Now, I agree with Dershowitz that there need to be lawyers who represent their clients like a taxi cab driver. You take whomever walks in the back of the cab, because otherwise the legal system will break down. But Dershowitz also says that you should only take cases that you are conscientious and can do a good job in. And for me personally, I can't take a case I don't believe in, and I can't represent a client I don't like. At some level, it don't have to be best buddies, but I need to like him at some level, because otherwise it will interfere with my ability to be effective on their behalf. And if I don't think they're innocent at some fundamental level, and that can be different than what the law defines as innocence, I can't be an effective advocate for them. And jurors sniff that out, judges sniff that out, opposing parties sniff that out. So for me to be effective, I have to believe in them, and that's why I limit myself to those clients, not because I think that's a good moral position, because actually I agree with Dershowitz. Lawyers need to be more broad in who they represent. But for me, that's all I can do. But yeah, there's plenty of people that get mad and agitated at me, but the worst were a combination of Nader, Trump, and Jones. Those are the three people that cost me the most friendships.
Well, you know what? It's less people to invite to your birthday party. So ultimately, you don't have to buy as big of a cake. If you boil down what Alex Jones does, it's like, I think why it's so important to hear him out is like he ultimately just questions authority. And when we can't question our authorities and our government, that's sad. That's like, it gets very scary very quick. And it's like, if people listen to him and you think, all right, this guy's full of shit. Okay, then like go about your day. It's just when we try to and he was one of the earliest people to be totally canceled and censored by social media. Like back before it was cool. Probably when did he start to get really censored? What, like 2017 or so?
Yeah, and you could argue the campaign against him started in the summer of 2016 when Hillary Clinton targeted him in a speech in, I think, Las Vegas. And that was the beginning of it. And from that point forward, all of a sudden, everybody's got a copyright claim against him. Everybody's got, there's all the Sandy Hook plaintiffs, again, 90% of whom had never complained or said a word to Alex Jones in 7 years. Suddenly now they're deeply bothered and have had their lives destroyed because of this. A lot of political lawyers all involved in a lot of those cases. And they used the lawsuits to then coordinate the mass canceling on big tech. Because, he was one of the most popular people on YouTube. YouTube had given him an early award. And on the same day, I believe, they used a judgment in a lawsuit. There wasn't a final judgment. It was just a preliminary ruling that allowed the case to go forward, that to have Facebook and YouTube through, which is basically Google, and Twitter, to get rid of him. I think all of them did it within a day or two. And not long thereafter, he was the first guy to out and say, I think Joe Biden might have some health issues, some mental cognitive issues. Instagram went nuts, and this is at that point was owned by Facebook. So Facebook not only removed his Instagram account for pointing out in advance what all of us now know is obvious, and not for misinformation, and then actually banned the use of his name. Said you could be banned if you. And it's not like Alex Jones is the most a totally uncommon name. So for all the other Alex Joneses out there, they were potentially
tough
screwed.
For them. Yeah,
exactly. He was the template, and they knew that the conservative establishment, like the liberal establishment, hated him. A lot of your anti-establishment people on the left had lost touch with him because they were so mad about him endorsing Trump, and they forgot that the number one advocate on the right against war is Alex Jones. The number one advocate on the right against the surveillance state is Alex Jones. The number one person on the right against big pharma is Alex Jones. The number one person on the right backing whistleblowers like Snowden and Assange and putting people like William Binney on for the last 10 plus years is Alex Jones. And yet they got suckered and snookered by the Sandy Hook plaintiffs' cases to demonize Alex Jones. People like Jimmy Dore, people like Max Blumenthal, people to some degree like Aaron Mate, people like Glenn Greenwald, who's scared to go on Alex Jones. And why? Alexander Cockburn was one of the most independent left. He was Glenn Greenwald before Glenn Greenwald. And who was the person who platformed him more than anybody? Alex Jones. But they forgot this. This was the most important populist anti-establishment voice on the right by far. It's not even close. There's nobody that compares to him. He was the leader of the lockdown protests, the first guy to point out the risks both of the virus and of the lockdown response to the virus. First guy to out Bill Gates and Bill Gates' role in all of this. And so he's a critical, essential voice, and they're not scared of him because they think he's wrong so often. They're scared of him because they know he's right so often.
And for people watching who don't know, where would you say, when did Alex's, I guess, other than being a target for being kind of over the target and right about many things, when did his sort of personal profile begin to be tarnished? Was it ultimately, what was it that he said about Sandy Hook? Did he say it was it could have been a false flag? What was it about that
most of the story about him and Sandy Hook is made up? So so Jones starts out on public access TV in the early 90s. became really popular, ended up with his own talk radio station there in Austin, or talk radio program, became intensely popular, and he was probably the next Rush Limbaugh in 2001. A lot of leftists loved him. He went up and busted into Bohemian Grove and filmed a bunch of stuff. He was in I think a Scanner Darkly and another film. He's hanging out with Willie Nelson. He's anti the Bush family, so all the Austin lefties love him. He's anti Big Pharma, anti-war, anti the surveillance state. And early on, a bunch of his predictions come true. I mean, he's 17 years old, and he's out there saying on the public access show that he would have around that time. But early on, he's out there telling people that the incubator baby story that led us into the Iraqi war is false. And it's because of who he grew up with and other people he knew. He has an inherent skepticism of power and the people who wield it and the people who get it and why they're doing it. And he knew the long history of them lying for all kinds of reasons to grab power. And he ends up right within a couple of years. And then, you have Waco and Ruby Ridge, and Waco's not far from where he is in Texas. And so he unravels a lot of those stories. Oklahoma City takes place. A lot of things are covered up related to that, including PatCon and other factors that now have sort of echoes in January 6th. And so he sees, and then he's been telling people that there's something like Operation Northwoods, and the government back in the 60s approved doing false flag and staged events. Everybody says you're nuts, Alex. And then in 1998, they declassify it. And yes, indeed, the Joint Chiefs of Staff signed off on staged false flag events in order to go to war with Cuba. And the only thing that stopped him was President Kennedy. And so he sees all these things confirmed and affirmed. And then he predicts several months in advance what's going to happen on 9/11 to a large degree. He's friends with the X-Files folks who do the Lone Gunman show, who do a show that almost is exactly the 9/11 script about 6 months before 9/11 happens.
Wow.
So he has a big choice to make. He's told if he goes and questions the institutional narrative on 9/11, that they will cancel him. All of his talk radio stations will cancel him. Institutional conservatives with Fox were all in the foxhole of 9/11 Bush talk during Bush's regime. Jones was a longtime critic of the Bush regime. He becomes a leader 9/11 skeptic, and that's the first time the institutional media puts him from, he's just sort of this little talk radio guy, and he's eclectic, and the left hangs out with him, to now he's a dangerous guy, dangerous misinformation. That's when that label first attaches to him, is his willingness to question the 9/11 narrative. And you flash forward, he's mostly politically agnostic, deep Bush family political critic. Until Obama, 2010, 2011, he becomes very skeptical of sort of the new liberal Democratic professional class, the beginning of the wokesters, and starts to become very critical of them. And he's perceived as being on the right, and that's when people on the left abandon him and start to become harshly critical. When Sandy Hook occurs, there's not much criticism because he says Sandy Hook happens, and he says the culprits are Big Pharma, the violence, the glorification of violence in gaming and Hollywood culture, the failure to have meaningful mental health treatment for so many mentally sort of limited individuals, the failures of the public educational system. That's what he highlights. And he says they're going to politicize it and blame the gun instead. And for 2 years, that's basically all that's said. And throughout the whole time period, 99% of what Infowars ever publishes or says Sandy Hook happened. He occasionally in the next couple of years will have a caller come in who he responds, and there was a portion of people who didn't believe Sandy Hook happened at all. And I have reasons why I think that psychologically they went that route. Denial is a very powerful tool if you have kids of your own around the same age of those kids who tragically and traumatically died there. But what caused most of the skepticism and blowback to Sandy Hook was how quickly the Obama administration politicized it. If they hadn't have politicized it so fast, it wouldn't have got the blowback that it got politically. The second problem that increased suspicion of a lot of people in that community was the government was weird about hiding information from the FOIA, Connecticut's version of FOIA. They wouldn't disclose basic records, basic information. You dig in, you find out why. After Columbine, there were basic safety mechanisms put in at schools across the country to avoid what happened at Columbine, at least the severity of it. And one of those was to make sure teachers could lock the doors of their classrooms and have other safe spaces within a classroom specifically for school safety, school shooter risks. Well, the school in Sandy Hook, the politicians pocketed the cash instead. They didn't have basic means to lock. The teachers couldn't even lock their own doors. They couldn't even lock the bathroom doors inside their classrooms. That's why the number of people that died that day likely died that day. And the politicians needed to hide that. And so they played games, blame the gun, blame the gun, blame the gun. That's part one of their defense. And part two is hide everything, hide everything, hide everything. But to people watching it, they think maybe there is something deeper going on here. Why are they hiding basic information? Like the police reports that they hid, I think, for almost 5 years.
Wow.
It turned out that was why people went fishing in the wrong place. But basically, they're suing him over a few statements over a few years in response to a few questions. I think it's a total of 30 words, something like that. I mean, that gave people who never complained at the time to the statements he made. They just sued him right out of the blue. I mean, there's a few people who, told him about a week or 2 weeks before they were going to sue him. But that's it. And so Sandy Hook, in my view, is the pretext, a politically effective pretext, but it's not the reason he's under attack. The real reason was partially his supporting of Trump in 2016. And the other, if people had the agenda, what we're seeing right now in terms of how the pandemic politically is playing out, the number one person warning of the risk related to this over the last 20 years has been Alex Jones. And the number one person you would want to deplatform would be Alex Jones. The number one person you would want to defame is Alex Jones. The number one person you don't want people to listen to is the one guy saying, by the way, I think China may be trying to do a bioweapon, or there's risk of a bioweapon leaking out. By the way, I think the government wants to use it as a pretext to legally control your body by forcing a vaccine into your system. I think the government wants to use this to have mass house arrest, things he's been talking about for 20 years. If you didn't want that voice being heard very much, you'd probably target him for lawfare and deplatforming.
It makes sense. And if you're looking to turn your population into just good little people who obey and never question, like, I can understand how he'd be among the first to take out